Welcome everyone to Navigating the World of Virtual Mediation and Arbitration, 25 Actionable Tips. We have received a host of questions from neutrals, clients, and the general public regarding virtual mediations and arbitrations, and this webinar will address those top 25 concerns we've received. We have a great panel today to address these concerns. Now, a couple of housekeeping things. If you're on your cell phone or tablet, in order to see everybody on the panel, you may need to swipe right or swipe left. If you're on your computer, on the top right-hand corner, you'll see something that says speaker view or gallery view. Click on that, and that'll let you be able to see all the panelists all at one time. Finally, if you're having trouble hearing me, meaning that you can't hear anything that I'm saying right now, make sure you check your audio settings and that you're projecting either from the audio from your computer or some other feature. Finally, we want this to be interactive. So there is a Q&A button. Just press that, send us your questions, and we'll get to those towards the end. Now, let me introduce our great panel. First off is Mayor Bianca Motley Broom. She's the mayor of College Park, Georgia, and a full-time neutral with Miles Mediation. She's also served as a magistrate judge in Fulton County, and prior to all of that, she was a senior trial attorney defending insurance companies. Next on the panel, we have Nigel Wright. Nigel is a New York attorney, Georgia attorney, and English solicitor. He was a senior partner at 2 AM law firms on both sides of the Atlantic. And Nigel was also in-house for 5 years in the US at 2 specialty international insurers in various senior management positions, where he was a corporate representative handling extra contractual and bad faith claims, well as the company's highest value claims for all classes of business. He's mediated every conceivable type of insurance and reinsurance claim for almost 30 years. Last but not least is Steve Dunn. He's had a 20-year litigation career at an employment law boutique firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. He represented private employers and industries including banking, education, technology, and construction, as well as public sector clients throughout North Carolina. He has extensive experience in employment discrimination, non-competition discrimination, non-competition agreements, trade secrets, and unfair trade practices. Steve has been a full-time neutral for over 10 years. Why don't you all just give them a nice virtual round of applause? And last but not least, I'm your host, Parag Shah. I'm a mediator, arbitrator, and special master at Miles. Now, without further ado, let's go ahead and get this show on the road. Now, I know what the number one concern is, and the number one concern that we've gotten is how secure are virtual mediations? And that's my first question to the group. How secure are these virtual mediations?
Parag, it's a great question. And there are a number of steps that we take to make sure that our mediations virtually on Zoom are secure. The security of Zoom video conferences depends almost entirely on the settings. So when you get an invitation to join a mediation, first of all, it's got a password. That means that you can't just jump into it willy-nilly, and those stories about Zoom bombing and those things just aren't really happening with a password. But we also start with a waiting room. So the neutral has the opportunity to make sure that who's supposed to be in the conference is actually there. We also go even further with breakout rooms to ensure that even if you do join the conference, somehow that you're not in the actual discussions that the parties are having. There's a lot of different layers, and we actually have a 10-step process to make sure that security is tight on our end as neutrals.
Bianca's absolutely right about the steps that we can take as neutrals to ensure that our mediations are private and secure. On Zoom's end, I had the opportunity to participate in a webinar that they hosted yesterday. We're all reading the same stories about these concerns, and the company is acting quickly. And in fact, they implemented an update to their software as recently as yesterday, which many of you may have downloaded when you signed up for this webinar today. So they're on it. And we also find it useful to remember that there's different kinds of clients and different kinds of cases, and they have different needs. The security needs of a state or government or an international technology company are different from those of a manufacturing company in rural North Carolina. And when we think about the security risk of participating in video mediation, it's also important to balance that against the risk of continuing on in litigation that's a distraction from your business and from your life.
It's also worth mentioning that as recently as yesterday, the Georgia Supreme Court authorized the use of Zoom for hearings. So the court system in Georgia, at least, considers it secure enough for the majority of their processes.
Now, let me ask you guys this. Can we record it secretly? You know, can I just record this right now?
One of these, right? we have a written contract forbidding all recording, first of all. And one of the things that we do in terms of security is we disable that recording option. So not just for the participants, but for the neutral, him or herself. So while it's certainly possible that someone could have their phone running, it's the same level of risk that you would take in a face-to-face mediation. So that aspect of it shouldn't be a concern.
I've been reading a lot about Zoom bombing and people coming into a virtual mediation or a Zoom meeting or without them having any permission to do so. How do you avoid that?
There are several things that you can do to prevent unauthorized access to a video mediation. First is to use a unique meeting invitation for each one, rather than using the same meeting invitation for all mediations. Secondly, it's important to require password access. And thirdly, it's important to structure the mediation so that when participants come in, they're admitted to a waiting room, and then we as the neutral individually admit each participant into the proceeding. So it's a three-step process for ensuring that only authorized participants are able to get in.
And even after all of that happens, it's my understanding that we have the ability, or the neutrals have the ability, to lock the meeting so that nobody new can come in. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And even in the event someone were to pass around the meeting ID or the password, even if somebody were to broadcast that email invitation to all their friends and family, it would only get you through 2 of the steps of the process. They're still going to have to be individually admitted by the neutral, whose responsibility it is to make sure who they are, who they're with, so that they can be admitted to the proper breakout room.
Now, you keep mentioning breakout rooms. I think our audience kind of wants to know, how secure are these breakout rooms? Can we overhear other breakout rooms? Tell me a little bit more about the breakout rooms.
Well, the breakout rooms are really the same as in a physical mediation. They actually have an additional advantage in that you can't actually be overheard. There are no thin walls. There are no inadvertent comments made in the corridor or as somebody's walking around getting a snack. So actually the virtual breakout rooms are exceptionally secure. There are, however, a couple of things just that you do need to bear in mind. The first is that the mediator can actually just join your breakout room. So what we try to do is to make sure that, first of all, the mediator agrees with the parties that they won't do that. And secondly, in terms of communicating with the parties in the breakout room, we often recommend that the mediator takes down the cell phone number, the email address, any kind of form of communication, which enables the mediator to contact the parties before basically asking whether or not the mediator can join that breakout room. However, the second point is that you can also leave it where the parties alone ask the mediator whether the mediator could join that meeting. There's a help button in the breakout room, and that basically summons the mediator.
One of the questions that we continuously have gotten is that, is virtual mediations really effective? We want to do them in person. We're kind of old school in that sense. Are there things missing in virtual mediations that you just can't make up?
I think it's fair to say that there are. a lot of people are trying to say that virtual mediations are just as good as physical mediations, but there are some elements that are different. And in particular, there's not quite the same tension when you're in a virtual mediation as though you're in person. There's not the time pressure that you don't have to beat traffic, you don't have to catch a train, a plane, you don't have to be somewhere at a particular time because the chances are you're mediating from your home. It's also a little bit harder to read people in video. Even though you can see reactions, it's just it's just not quite the same. And then I would also say that most lawyers enjoy handling paper. I know it sounds a strange thing to say, but when you're looking at something jointly and you're peering over a piece of paper, whether it's a damage calculation, whether it's a case, whether it's a document that people want to examine, there is something about looking at the actual physical document itself, which I think is missing in virtual mediations. But generally speaking, you've got to look at it as it's different, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily worse.
Nigel, that's a lot of doom and gloom. Can I hear something beneficial about the virtual mediations from one of you guys?
Well, I think there's a lot of things about it that actually work quite well, and in some ways are better than meeting in person. And this is surprising to me to say. I wouldn't have imagined this even just a month ago, but our whole industry has been reinvented. And what we've learned very quickly is that there are things that we can do mediating by video that are assistive to the process. My favorite thing is we can make sure that anybody who needs to be there can be there without any excuse, no matter how far away they are or how much it might cost or whether they've got a whole day to set aside for the process or not. We can bring people in, whether they're knowledgeable witnesses or decision makers, and whether or not they need to set aside an entire day or get on a plane to be there, we can make sure they're there. And this is just the beginning of, I think, what we're going to learn about the advantages that video mediation brings to settling cases.
One of the questions that we've received is virtual mediation suitable for all types of cases, or is it only for a certain group of cases?
I don't think there's a limit to the kinds of cases that you can mediate virtually. If your case was suitable for mediation in person, then it can work virtually as well. And one of the great things about having this group of folks is learning how to navigate that, because certainly we handle these multi-party complex cases, but you can do those virtually. It takes more work on the parties to be a little bit more flexible, but I think that all of us have found that people are actually a little bit more flexible in this environment, and they understand that we all have to adapt. I'm sorry, Parag, but it's not the process. It is the process. It's not the medium that resolves the cases.
I think that's a great point. One of the questions that we've gotten is all this mention of breakout rooms and the more complex and the different parties that are involved. It's really not something that the end user has to worry about. You as the neutral are the ones setting up the breakout rooms, assigning people to the breakout rooms, and they don't really have to worry about figuring all that. Is that correct, Bianca?
Yes, that is correct. In fact, prior to the mediation actually going forward, one of the things that I do is I set up all the breakout rooms, and then everyone joins from their waiting rooms, but I let folks in individually, and I let them know where they're going to go, and then I send them to that breakout room. Ideally, because most people, this is technology that's new for them, they've walked through it with me before. I usually am on an hour beforehand, or we've set up time prior to even that day to make sure that everyone's comfortable with the process.
Now, one of my signature moves as a litigator was to drop the mic and walk out of the mediation and say, this is not happening. How do I walk out of this virtual mediation? I feel like I can't drop the mic, Steve. What do I do?
Parag, I don't think your signature move works quite as well in the video mediation context. In my experience, when I come into a breakout room and I see the lawyers and the parties standing up and packing up their briefcases and acting like they're going to walk out, most of the time they're hoping I'm going to be able to talk them down and keep them there. If anything, I think that mediating in a video context really eliminates a lot of those types of theatrics, frankly. You're in a breakout room where no one else can see or hear anything that you're doing. And in a way, it's almost too easy to walk out because you literally just have to click a button at the bottom of your screen. So I haven't seen nearly as much huffing and puffing as we used to. It's a different type of process, but it still works effectively.
It sounds like it may be more civil. Is that accurate?
I do think so. It's a lot harder to demonstrate significant anger or lose your temper without a live audience. I mean, that's one of the things about a physical mediation is that you have that live audience. Well, on a virtual mediation, you simply don't. And so the effect is nowhere near as strong. And consequently, people tend not to do it. So I do feel that there's a little bit more civility. I think that everybody's also feeling their way in terms of what they can and can't do in a virtual mediation. So maybe that'll change. I hope it won't. But certainly at the moment, people do seem to be very civil, which is great.
Now, a lot of parties use mediation as their day in court. How do you help those parties who are looking for their day in court, the mediation to be their day in court, when it's being handled virtually?
Well, I think exactly the same way that you do in a physical mediation. You need to spend time with people and you need to listen to what they've got to say. One of the advantages actually of virtual mediation is that the party speaking has to finish before somebody else gets to go. And so what this actually means is that each participant, when they're speaking, can go on. So at the moment, if Parag's trying to get me to stop, it's a little harder. If we were physically in the same room, he could easily talk over me. And so consequently, I think those things help those parties who really want to have their story heard. They want, and so no one's going to interrupt them. They have the floor, so to speak. And I do think that's an important part of the process for many parties.
The mute button is a big feature on Zoom, that when you press mute, they may start talking, but you still can't hear anything. And that kind of helps, I think, what you're saying as well, Nigel. Now, yes. Ding, 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 ding. You know what that bell is? That bell means that there's time for one war story in this webinar. So I want all of y'all to go around and tell us the worst thing that has happened.
So far, well, I've got 3 dogs. So usually with trash day, they get pretty excited. So I think people have generally been pretty patient with that. But everyone's got something else going on right now. We're not just at home sitting there with nothing else going on in our lives. So everyone has to be a little bit flexible, a little bit more open to the interruptions that might come that are certainly unexpected. Yesterday, I was doing a mediation and I had a neighbor ringing my doorbell at the same time that my dogs were going crazy. And I just had to explain, give me about 2 minutes, we'll take care of it and it's fine. And other people have experienced that as well.
What about you guys? Steve, tell me your war story.
The most frustrating thing that I've encountered is technical glitches, usually related to connectivity. Internet connection that makes the video freeze. It makes it impossible to hear somebody. I even had somebody drop out completely, and then we had to scramble to figure out how to get that person back involved by telephone. We were able to do it, but it was disruptive, and that's just one of those things that we have to file under, aspects of video mediation that aren't as good as in person.
What about you, Nigel?
Well, I would actually echo what Bianca said. I have 3 teenagers in the house, as well as 2 dogs, and there's a very active squirrel population where we live. So at any given time, it can get a little noisy. So really, patience and understanding is something that, personally, I would hope the participants would think about. The other thing, sorry, I know you said one, but the other issue that I have come across is that sometimes not everybody's working at home. I mean, we think we're all working at home, but there are some parties who are allowed to work, and there may be other people there. So having somebody who is outside of the mediation walk by or make a comment to somebody who is in the mediation is something that we need to try and manage that, because obviously they haven't signed a mediation agreement, and they are confidential mediations.
Mayor Bianca Motley Broom, anybody
Yes.
that has met you knows that meeting you in person is an amazing experience. How do you create a relationship like how you do in person virtually?
As Nigel said earlier, and by the way, thank you very much. That's awfully kind of you. But I'm always looking for ways to connect with people. And this environment absolutely gives us the opportunity to do that. Whether it's someone whose child or pet happens to walk across the screen, it's a great way to make that connection with people. I do that, I look at cell phone covers and such, and we might find that we are both Cleveland Browns football fans, when we're in real life. So there are ways to connect with people. You obviously have those opportunities because you're meeting them a little bit earlier as well to go through the technology and such. So it's a bit more of a challenge, but I think for those of us who really strive to make those connections, it's not that difficult.
Steve, I want to talk to you about something that one of my techniques that I use as a neutral. Sometimes I like to catch the attorney as they're going to the bathroom, and that's kind of my time to privately talk to the attorney. How do I use my bathroom technique in a virtual mediation?
Well, Parag, I'm not going to comment on your bathroom technique, but there are many ways to arrange for breakout rooms. That's the key. We have learned it's important to set up more breakout rooms than you think you're going to need at the beginning of a mediation. And what this facilitates is the ability to put together different groups of people. That might be a lawyer's talk with the mediator. Sometimes it's beneficial to the process for the parties to talk to each other, either with or without the mediator. With breakout rooms, we have the ability, it's very easy to move individual participants around in different combinations, whatever it's going to take to settle the case.
And Steve, how would you be able to message that you want to talk to that person when right now there are 4 other people in this session? How do I tell you, Steve, hey, I need to kind of talk to you privately about something? How do you do that?
Well, one of the things that I've found from doing video mediations is that it helps a lot to use different communication technologies. I've become quite an active texter during mediations. It's a great way, if you exchange mobile phone numbers at the beginning of the process, to chat with each other and get information and send messages without actually having to bounce back and forth between the breakout rooms. Whatever works for whoever you're trying to communicate with. There are some people for whom email is the best way to reach them quickly, but using other methods of communicating has been extremely effective as part of this video mediation process.
Nigel, now the type of mediations that you do are extremely complex, document heavy, and I'm sure when you're doing them in person, there's all kinds of preparation that the participants do. What is the best way to prepare for these virtual mediations?
Well, I always feel that a mediation potentially for every party that participates is a trial. Because at the end of it, if you actually reach an agreement, you have altered your legal rights and you have resolved the case, or you've resolved a large part of the case. And so my own personal view is that parties should prepare very carefully. The more you can put in down on paper in your pre-mediation briefs, the better. And the reason I say that is that what it does is it enables the mediator to fully understand and identify the issues before you go in, and therefore he or she has the ability to work on hopefully bringing the parties together rather than spending hours trying to find out exactly what the true issue is. That doesn't mean that won't go on, it's just you're going to be able to truncate it with preparation. And so I always encourage the parties to set out what they want to communicate, but set out your objectives, put them in writing. You don't have to share them with a mediator, but make sure you're well prepared and be flexible. Your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, which is what a lot of parties use when going into a mediation, may require completely different analysis in today's world, but you should still have it. In the event that you don't resolve the case, you do need to think very carefully about what the alternatives will be and when they will be achieved.
when we're talking about preparation, obviously there's different levels of preparation. There are, pre-mediation briefs that the lawyers or the participants can send to the mediator. But what about things that are a little bit more complex, like accident reconstructions or video presentations? How do you make that effective in this virtual mediation?
Well, I've always felt that in complex cases, maybe product liability cases, having visual aid, whether it's a video, whether it's a computer-aided design, have always been incredibly impactful in a mediation. And that's still the same virtually. I mean, there's a good argument that it's more impactful because while the video is playing or the CAD presentation, everybody's looking at it. You're not worried that somebody is playing on their phone. You're not worried about where they're positioned in the room. The one thing that you can't see there is their reaction. So that impact may not be quite the same for you, but it will be for them.
One of the questions that we've just gotten in is, are virtual mediations shorter or longer? I know that's a big question. Bianca, what are your thoughts?
So far, I haven't found that they are either. I mean, they're about the same for me. But one of the nice things about being able to mediate in this way is that there's less pressure, because if you're sitting in an office space and you've got that window view and you can see traffic starting to pile up, you start thinking, I need to get out of here. We've got to wrap this up. And that just hasn't really been the case in dealing with mediations virtually. People are comfortable wherever they are, whether if it's in that office that they're working in because they're the only person there, or if they're at home. And I love the ability to be able to work with parties beyond that virtual mediation in a much more flexible way. We're able to say, okay, we might need an hour or 30 minutes to reconvene, and it doesn't take a whole rescheduling process. So I think that aspect of virtual mediations is really an asset.
I have another question for you guys, which is, how do you avoid, or is multitasking, because I imagine that since we're all at home and we're able to multitask, how is that, is that a problem?
Look, according to my wife, yes.
Get familiar with it in a relaxed context. It's very easy. I set my mom up this morning, and it's really easy to get going, especially in this environment where we are detached from one another. It's a great way to connect.
I have not paid my internet bill, I'm not going to lie. And so I fear that the next time we do this Zoom session, I may accidentally get cut off or my internet may freeze. Steve, talk to me about these kind of technical difficulties.
Well, I'm going to make sure that I have your mobile phone number at the beginning of the process so that I'm able to reach you, whether that's to check in on you if I'm in a different breakout room, or to deal with some sort of unexpected thing that happens. And it does happen. I've had individuals who had connectivity problems, and fortunately, the platform that we use enables calling in by telephone, and it really works quite well, and we're all familiar with it from calling into bridge conference lines over the years. So even if you get cut off, we're going to have a way to reach you and a way to bring you back in and continue the process.
Now, the participants that are on this webinar right now watching us, your situation looks amazing with that background and the way you look and sound. Tell us some good tips about how you're making that happen.
Well, thank you, Parag. I'm flattered to hear you say that. In fact, there are just some very basic things that you can do to make sure you look and sound good in a video conference. For lighting, the main thing is to make sure that the light is in your face and not behind your head, right? So it's not great to sit in front of a bright open window or to be lit from behind. For sound, computers and laptops have better microphones typically than phones and tablets do. But the main thing is to have your volume adjusted at such a level so that the output from your speakers doesn't create feedback with your microphone. But I can illustrate for you by turning off my light and just moving the microphone away from my head. I don't know how I sound to you now.
Terrible.
But I would expect that it didn't, that I sound and look better now than I did a moment ago. And that's with just a couple of very basic things.
As someone who's actually still struggling with that, because my green screen and my lights haven't arrived yet, I seem to have the only house that doesn't have a single light colored wall. If you are fortunate enough to have a house with a light colored wall, I would strongly recommend that you use that as a background. Unfortunately, I don't. Not at the moment. I'm working on it.
Nigel, one of the questions we've gotten is, what happens if the other side is being unreasonable? You know, I'm sure that some people believe that in in-person mediations, there's this kind of emotional pressure or things that you can do if someone's being unreasonable. How are the dynamics in a virtual mediation?
Well, of course, as you know, unreasonableness is a matter of perspective. But assuming that it's objectively unreasonable, it's the same way that you deal with the physical mediation. You really need to listen to what people are saying, not just the words, but the emotion. Most of us that practice mediation, we actually do a little bit of work around the subject. And so I've been very fortunate to have read some great books about how to deal with awkward people, how to deal with emotions, whether you're listening to the words or the emotion, which is more important in any given circumstance. And I do think that for mediators, it is important to hone those particular skills, but essentially they're the same skills that you have in a physical mediation. Let somebody finish, listen to what they have said, and listen to the emotion of what they've said, and find out what the key issues are, because it's not always the specific words that they have said.
You guys have been doing such a great job that there are a flurry of questions coming in, and I want to let all the participants know who are watching to keep having your questions come in. But before I get to the questions, I do want to ask each of you to briefly share some experience that you've had mediating virtually that you think might be helpful for the people watching and listening.
Sure. I think it's really helpful to make sure that each participant has their own device that they are participating with. Trying to share a device, whether it's a client that has come into an attorney's office and they're sitting across the table from one another, turning a computer back and forth is not as effective. If you can find another device and separate folks by rooms, that's going to help each person participate more actively. And it's also going to help in terms of making sure you don't get feedback when people are speaking and their speakers are picking up that information.
For me, I would say, don't be scared of change. The first virtual mediation that I did, I was really pretty terrified because I'd never done one before. And it was fairly early on. And so no one was completely sure whether it would work or not. Fortunately, it did work. And in fact, after a while, and a relatively short period of time, you sort of forget that you're mediating virtually because you have the same intensity in terms of concentration and you're facing exactly the same issues. So what I would say is embrace the change. We don't know when the current situation will change. We all hope it will. But in the meantime, virtual mediations can and do work.
I think most of us strongly prefer being in person and probably never thought we'd be doing all our mediations by video. And the reason is because it's important to the process for people to communicate to each other and to be understood. And that's, you know, I alluded to light and sound just a moment ago, and it's really not about looking good. It's about communicating. And so I've had a couple where I had one where the lawyer spent the whole day with her camera pointed at the ceiling and I could only see the top of her head. And I was not able to she was not able to effectively communicate with the other participants for that reason. So I think if you're thoughtful about those things, you know, in this time that we're living through, mediating by video can be awfully close to mediating in person in terms of its effectiveness.
This concludes the questions that were already submitted before we started this, which led to this webinar.